Hello guys and welcome back. If you are new around here, I cover mostly Australian true crime cases and today we are covering another solved case. So let's just get straight into it. In August of 2010, 6-year-old Kiesha Abrahams, born on April the 22nd, 2004, lived in Mount Druitt, Western Sydney. She lived with her mother, 27-year-old Kristi Abrahams, and Kristi's de facto partner, Robert Smith. Kiesha's biological father was Chris Whippet. Now, during my research, some reports referred to Kiesha as Kiesha Abrahams, her mother's last name, and some refer to her as Kiesha Whippet, her father's last name. And from my own experience, when this story was in the headlines, she was called Kiesha Abrahams predominantly. And I think that's the name that most people remember her by. But just from this point forward in the video, I'm going to be calling her Kiesha Whippet. Now, Kiesha was not Chris and Kristi's first child together. At 18 years old in 2002, the pair, after only being together for 2 months, found out that they were pregnant, and this was not welcoming news for the pair. But they did decide to keep the baby, as Kristi said she didn't believe in abortion. However, it was a very turbulent pregnancy, with Kristi smoking and drinking through basically the entire pregnancy, although she did say she had cut back. Apparently, Kristi was actually described as a nice and a well-dressed girl by friends of the couple, and she actually had her own unit as well, which was a housing commission unit. But she did spend her time living between the Whippet's family home and her own unit during the pregnancy. And the Whippet family home consisted of Chris, of course, his 3 brothers, and his mother, Liz. So Chris was actually dealing with his own struggles at the time. Aside from being 18 years old and having a child on the way, he'd actually been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes just the year before. So he was not only going through his own health struggles, but dealing with a turbulent relationship and a turbulent pregnancy. At one point during the pregnancy, Chris told his mother, Liz, that Kristi had been punching herself in the stomach. Despite the fact she said she didn't believe in abortions, she was attempting to self-abort, but she was unsuccessful. They went on to have a little boy named Aiden on February the 6th, 2003. Before Kristi even managed to leave the hospital with her newborn son, the Department of Community Services, or DOCS, was called in relation to Kristi's aggression towards the hospital's nurses. DOCS visited Kristi at home with Aiden a few days later, but saw nothing of concern. The turbulence in Kristi and Chris's relationship continued, however, after Aiden was born, and Kristi just wasn't coping well with being a first-time mum, and of course a young mum on top of that. She would become angry and aggressive at any given moment towards those around her, and she also was underfeeding Aiden, giving him about half of his recommended serve of baby formula. After one particularly bad argument the couple had, Kristi was so infuriated that she slashed her own wrist with a knife. And then she came at Chris with a pair of scissors. When Chris's brother stepped in to stop her, he got stabbed in the hand. And unsurprisingly, the police were called during this violent argument. One night after a particularly tumultuous event in the Whippet family home, where Chris's ex-girlfriend actually came to visit, Kristi decided she was going to take Aiden back to her own unit for the night. Now, since Aiden had been born, Kristi had pretty much been staying with the Whippets, and she hadn't really stayed at her own unit by herself with Aiden. And Liz, Chris's mum, was quite concerned, as it was mostly Liz and Chris that would get up to feed Aiden during the night. not Kristi. But Chris did end up eventually going with her back to her unit to help her look after Aiden that night. So at 2:30 a.m. that morning, Chris got up to feed and change Aiden and went back to bed. Now, Aiden usually got fed again at around 6 a.m., but neither parent woke up. At midday, Chris and Kristi finally woke up at Kristi's unit, and Kristi asked Chris to go check on Aiden for her. When Chris found Aiden, he was lying face down in his cot. He was blue and cold. Chris ran to his mother's house, who lived just down the road, screaming for help. Liz and Chris went back to Kristi's unit, where Kristi was sitting on the floor, cradling Aiden. He's cold, we need another blanket, she kept repeating. Aiden was pronounced dead later that day. One thing Liz Whippet noticed from the events of that day was that although Kristi was hysterical over Aiden's death, she never actually cried. She never shed a tear. She wailed and she was in hysterics, but she never cried. At the time, police had found the death of the infant a little suspicious, given the couple's history with docs, but a post-mortem found no signs of abuse or obvious cause of death. Aiden's death ended up being classified as SIDS, or Sudden Infant Death Syndrome. It should be noted that SIDS isn't considered a diagnosis, but the term given when the cause of an infant's death is unknown, but it's not considered suspicious. It should also be noted that when a baby is under 6 months old, it is almost impossible to differentiate between suffocation and SIDS, because a baby that young cannot show any signs of a struggle. Constable Philip Taylor stated on the matter, "My gut feeling is that it was a SIDS case. I honestly feel the parents didn't do anything adverse towards Aiden. I just think they didn't have the sound knowledge towards parenting. I feel they tried, but unfortunately when kids have kids, these things happen." And that was basically that on Aiden's death. Kristi and Chris's relationship continued after Aiden passed away, and the following year, on the 22nd of April 2004, they had a little girl, Kiesha Whippet. When Kiesha was 15 months old, Kristi told Chris their relationship was over, and of course, this resulted in another argument. This was when Chris witnessed Kristi abuse their young toddler for the first time. He saw Kristi pick Kiesha up by her neck and dump her on the sofa. When Kiesha began crawling away, Kristi picked her up and bit her on the shoulder. Little Kiesha screamed. Chris left to call the police, and when the police arrived and saw the bite mark on Kiesha, they asked Kristi what was going on, and her response was, "She bit me, so I bit her back." Despite there being no injuries on Kristi's own body, Kristi pled guilty to assault, and Kiesha was taken off her mother and put into the care of Chris and his mother Liz. So Kristi came around to visit Chris not long after the biting incident, and she brought some paperwork with her relating to Kiesha. She asked Chris to sign the paperwork, and he signed it without reading it. 2 days later, the Department of Community Services showed up at the Whippet home to take Kiesha into foster care. The paperwork that Kristi had him sign declared that he was an unfit parent incapable of raising a child. It was during this time that Kristi met her partner, Robert Smith, described as a shy and quiet individual. So Kristi was actually fighting to get her daughter back from foster care, but during this time she was arrested twice for driving without a license, and this didn't exactly make the best impression that she was a reliable parent to Kiesha. Kristi had also been attending anger management classes and parenting classes during the time that Kiesha was in foster care. In late 2006, Kristi was arrested over outstanding warrants for traffic offences. 2 months after this incident, Kiesha was returned to her mother. It had been 18 months since Kiesha had been in her mother's care. Chris and his mother Liz were not informed when this happened. A year later, Kristi Abrahams was pregnant with her third child. The father was Robert Smith. And when Kristi was at the hospital, during a checkup with her third baby, the nurse noticed a bruise on little Kiesha's face, and she actually reported this to docs. The following day, a caseworker showed up at Kristi's home. There they found a cigarette burn on the 3-year-old girl's little body. When they asked Kiesha what had happened, she said, "Mum hit there. Mum did that." Despite this, no further action was taken. And after this, sorry, that's my cat. And after this, Kristi Abrahams went on to have another little girl named Brianna. So we're going to take a step back for a moment and discuss Kristi Abrahams' own childhood and upbringing. So Kristi herself had had a pretty traumatic childhood. She grew up being a victim of abuse and a witness to severe domestic violence against her mother from her father. Although her mother tried to leave her father several times, as with many situations involving domestic violence, it is not always easy to leave. Kristi was also dragged around a lot as a kid, going from school to school, city to city, and never really having the chance to settle down and make a solid group of friends. But despite all of this, Kristi was described as a good kid, confident, and a kid that got along with everyone at school. At age 10, Kristi found her own mother dead. Her mother, who had suffered from epilepsy, had had an epileptic fit and passed away. And the only people home at the time were Kristi and Kristi's 3-year-old brother. Now, it was usually Kristi that did assist her mother when she had an epileptic fit, but this time she was unable to help her. After her mother died, Kristi's father didn't want anything to do with her or her brother. And due to the fact that the epilepsy was likely the result of years of physical abuse by Kristi's own father, Kristi didn't really want anything to do with her father either. She blamed her father for her mother's death. Kristi was then sent from foster home to foster home, but was subject to racism due to her Aboriginal background. Her mother had been Caucasian and her father had been Indigenous. Kristi also struggled growing up because of an intellectual disability, which she actually hid pretty well because of her really outgoing personality. So just to give you an idea of the things that Kristi witnessed and experienced growing up, I'm going to read you a list of things that she wrote when she was 11 years old. It's entitled, "The Things I Remember That My Dad Did to My Mum." 1. When my dad strangled my mum when we were going out to the car. This was in Queensland. 2. When my dad had steel cap boots on and kicked her in the head. 3. When my dad had a big bottle and went to throw it in between my mum's legs. 4. My dad went to punch her on the nose and broke her nose. 5. And he kept hurting my mum on the head. 6. When my mum went to work and my dad was minding me, and when my mum came home I had bruises all over me. 7. And when I went to school I fell off a big beam, and when I went was home time, he went to kick my very sore leg. 8. My dad went to kick my mum in the tummy really hard. 9. When my dad went to hit my mum in the mouth and my mum had a fat lip or mouth. Kristi stayed in group homes up until the age of 16, and then at 16 she moved into a women's refuge for 2 years. At 18 she got her own housing commission unit, and this is also when she fell pregnant with Aiden. Now, I don't tell you the story of Kristi's upbringing to make you feel sympathetic or any which way towards her. It is here just to give you some context. In August of 2010, Kristi Abrahams and Robert Smith reported 6-year-old Kiesha Whippet missing in a frantic and tearful call to police. They claim they woke up to find the front door of the unit open and Kiesha missing. Kristi initially told police she believed Kiesha who enjoyed playing with the stray kittens in the neighborhood, had just wandered off from their unit in search of the kittens. By this time, Kristi had given birth to her fourth child, a son. Her second daughter was now 2 years old. So Kristi told police she put Kiesha to bed at 9:30 p.m. the night before after watching a movie, The Golden Compass. She had been wearing pink pajamas and a purple pumpkin patch jacket. Kristi said when she woke up around 9 a.m, Kiesha was gone. Police quickly arrived at Kristi's home to investigate little Kiesha's disappearance, and they noted two things. One, that there was no signs of forced entry, and two, Kiesha's bed was weirdly made neatly. It was made, but the bedsheet, the doona, was basically pulled back. So very strange and very neat for a 6-year-old little girl. And if she had been abducted, that's even stranger. If she had run away, that's still very strange. Chris Whippet and his mother Liz didn't even know that Kiesha had been returned to her mother until police turned up on their doorstep telling them that his daughter was missing and Liz's granddaughter. Chris was quickly cleared of being a suspect, however, despite Kristi pointing the finger at him, as he had been in hospital having an operation in relation to his type 1 diabetes at the time Kiesha had gone missing. That and the fact that Chris had not been involved in Kiesha's life for the last 5 years. So the public really got behind Kristi Abrahams and her partner initially, and Kristi eventually made a tearful public plea in front of the media for Kiesha's safe return. Robert Smith stated during one of their pleas to the public, "Last time I saw her, we were watching a movie together. You know, someone must know something. Please come forward. She was beautiful, you know. Funny, always happy." Now let me read you that last line again. She was beautiful. Funny, always happy. She was, past tense. Just keep that piece of information in mind as the story progresses. I'll play a clip for you now of the couple speaking to the media.
She was beautiful. You want to see her? Can I please contact the police?
She's always happy, bubbly, you know, love playing, you know, just like any kid would. Someone must know something. Please come forward.
So not everybody believed this sad and devastated front that the couple put on in front of the media. Liz Whippet, Kiesha's grandmother, said that the talking and the wailing that Kristi had displayed to the media reminded her of the day that Aiden died. According to Liz, Kristi showed the same crying but no tears reaction or crocodile tears that she had back then. Liz began to think that something more was going on with Kiesha's disappearance. A huge search began for 6-year-old Kiesha, with hundreds of police and SES volunteers searching throughout Sydney. But interestingly though, there was 2 people that were not involved in this search, and that was Kristi Abrahams and Robert Smith. And in fact, when all these searches were going on, Kristi was out getting her nails done, getting her hair done, and moving houses. Locals even held candlelit vigils outside of the Abrahams' home, praying for Kiesha's safe return. People brought flowers, soft toys, and handwritten messages to the Mount Druitt home and left them there for Kiesha's safe return. Unfortunately, one of the teddy bears that had been left there for Kiesha had fallen on one of the candles, and this ended up setting the whole area alight. The police investigation very quickly uncovered that Kiesha had not been seen by anybody except for Kristi and Robert for 3 weeks prior to her disappearance. And in fact, she had only attended 4 days of school in 2 terms. And being that she was only 6 years old, That meant she had attended 4 days of school in her life. Truant officers had visited the family home 7 times, in fact, but were often met with no answer at the door. And teachers had also reported bruises on Kiesha when she had attended school. When investigators searched Kristi and Robert's unit, they found Kiesha's blood, or droplets of Kiesha's blood, in several different areas throughout the unit, which included the play area, the linen closet, the entrance to her bedroom, and on the bedroom door. Disturbingly, police also noticed teeth marks on the bed frame of Kiesha's wooden bed. 20 bags of evidence were gathered during the search of the unit, including a vacuum cleaner and their computer. And it wasn't long before the police were focusing in on Kristi Abrahams and Robert Smith. Although at the time they were keeping an open mind to the possibility that Kiesha had wandered off on her own accord or that she had been abducted, as unlikely as that seemed. But it wasn't long before it was officially ruled as a homicide investigation. Over the following 9 months, a very meticulously planned police investigation was carried out, including using undercover police officers and hidden surveillance of Robert and Kristi. During interviews with both Kristi and Robert over the following months of the investigation, although both of them remained cooperative with police, Kristi appeared aggravated and aggressive during much of the questioning, defensive almost. Robert, on the other hand, was quiet and doesn't give much away to investigators. By January of the following year, investigators publicly announced that they believe Kiesha Whippet is deceased. 8 months after Kiesha's disappearance, her remains are found buried in bushland in Western Sydney, and it had been Kristi Abrahams herself, as well as Robert Smith, that had unknowingly led investigators directly to Kiesha's grave. In April of 2011, just after midnight, police followed Kristi and Robert into bushland, where the pair were laying flowers on the ground. Kristi had actually confessed to killing her daughter to an undercover police officer before taking the officer to the grave of her daughter. This day also happened to be Kiesha's 7th birthday. Kristi and Robert were arrested on the spot. So let's talk about exactly what happened to little Kiesha Whippet. In July of 2010, Kiesha was killed by her own mother and her mother's de facto partner. She wasn't abducted and she didn't run away, as Kristi had the public believe. And it was 3 weeks after she was killed that she was reported missing by Kristi and Robert. According to Kristi, the day Kiesha died, Kiesha fell and hit her head on the edge of her bed and became unconscious. Instead of seeking medical assistance like any normal parent would do, Kristi and Robert put Kiesha under a cold shower in an attempt to revive her. She didn't wake up. Despite Kiesha's unresponsive state, the couple thought the next best thing to do was put Kiesha to bed for the night and just hope she woke up in the morning. The next morning, when Kristi and Robert went to check on her, they found she had passed away from her injuries. Again, instead of phoning any kind of emergency services at this point, Kristi and Robert put Kiesha's lifeless body in a suitcase and they left her there for several days. During this time, Robert goes to a place he is familiar with in a nearby bushland and digs a shallow grave. Several days after this, Kristi and Robert take Kiesha's lifeless body in the suitcase in a taxi using fake names and disguises to the shallow grave. They lay her body in it, douse her in petrol and set little Kiesha alight. They then bury her remains and burn the suitcase. It would be another 2 weeks from this point until Kristi and Robert would report Kiesha missing. Kristi and Robert then attempt to cover up their crime by throwing away any shoes, clothing, and even mobile SIM cards that could link them back to Kiesha's death. After Kiesha's passing, the pair continue to buy children's toys for Kiesha to give the illusion they both believe she's alive and well out there and that she will be returning home soon. In April of 2011, Kristi is held up in a hotel room with an undercover police officer where she cries as she confesses what really happened to her daughter. And the whole thing is recorded. Kristi and Robert then take the undercover police officer to Kiesha's grave on her 7th birthday, where the arrest took place. A post-mortem of Kiesha's body revealed that she had been subjected to severe long-term physical abuse. It was likely that Kiesha had been abused for much of her short 6 years here on Earth. Post-mortem results showed injuries including teeth fractures and 10 separate bone injuries. The bone injuries indicated repeated blows in the months leading up to Kiesha's death that a pathologist stated would have left Kiesha in considerable pain. Her nose, jaw and skull also revealed a history of wounds, and her arm bones showed signs consistent with severe twisting. And these results were just what they could get out of her skeletal remains. Kiesha's official date of death is thought to be July the 13th. Tragically, it was revealed after Kiesha's death that many around her suspected she was being abused or had had the abuse reported to them, including teachers, police and relatives. Sadly, no further action was ever taken to prevent this little girl's untimely death. Kiesha's biological father, Chris Whippet, was devastated at the news that his now second child had passed away under such horrifying circumstances. He got both Aiden and Kiesha's names tattooed on his arm. In November of 2012, his mother Liz came home to find him dead in his bed. His death certificate says natural causes and pending. It is also possible he died from diabetes-related complications. In June of 2013, after attempting to have her charge downgraded from murder to manslaughter and being rejected, Kristi Abrahams faces a trial by jury. She eventually pleads guilty. In July of 2013, Kristi Abrahams is sentenced to a non-parole period of 16, yeah, you heard that right, 16 years. The maximum sentence she will serve is 22 years. The judge explained Kristi's light sentence by saying that there was actually no proof that Kristi intended to kill her daughter, only that she intended to cause serious injury. The judge also said that he didn't find there was sufficient proof to show that it had been Kristi Abrahams and Robert Smith that had inflicted the severe abuse upon Kiesha in the months and years before her death. He described the crime as middle of the range in seriousness because it had been impulsive and an uncontrolled act of violence. The judge, Judge Ian Harrison, said he also took into account Kristi's own traumatic past, her upbringing, her childhood, the fact that she was abused and witnessed domestic violence, and also took into account her intellectual disability. The judge stated, "The death of the deceased is the foreseeable and predictable consequence of preventable cyclic abuse. The offender's failings are mirrored in the failings of others." Kristi Abrahams showed no emotions as the verdict was read, and as she was being led away, a member of the public gallery shouted to her, "Rot in hell." Officer Russell Oxford, who was in charge of the Kiesha Abrahams investigation and was pretty emotional when the verdict was read out, stated, "If nothing else comes out of today, we should all take stock of where we are in this world and go home and hug our kids." Robert Smith was sentenced separately to Kristi. He pled guilty to manslaughter and being an accessory to Kiesha's death. He got a non-parole period of 12 years and will serve a maximum of 16. So there's so much to think about and discuss in this case. Was Kristi Abrahams just a product of her upbringing? Was she just following a pattern that she was all too familiar with? And why didn't docs do more to step in or intervene when there was evidence of abuse in the home? Of course, that is a whole another topic into itself. But let me know what you think in the comments below. I'll be very interested to hear everyone's thoughts and feelings on this case, and of course remembering to keep it respectful, please. Please, most of you are amazing. 1% of you aren't always respectful, you know what I'm saying? Anyway, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for listening to little Kiesha Whippet's story. And of course, remembering her father too, Chris Whippet, who passed away. Like, comment, subscribe, share, notifications. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I will see you soon.